It's a real privilege to be here today. It's a privilege because I am among people who are so committed to a childcare system that is the best for all children and their families, you know, whatever it takes. And I am amongst people who all undertake advocacy for such a system, and people who have been renowned activists and still are. And I do think that that history of Canadian childcare activism has got to be written up, because I think you are ahead of the curve compared to many other countries who are trying for the best system they can create. And it's not the only area in which I think you are ahead of the curve. I think in making the promotion of non-profits an issue, despite the complexities that Christopher has explained so well to us, I think that's important too. And I'm really talking about Canada amongst the countries who are somewhere on that journey where Denmark is way ahead of us. You know, we all admit that, but it still matters. So my next slide then, my first one, is a very general one about the situation in England. Yes, I'm already disappointing you. Not only am I going to touch on issues that have all been raised in the 13 panel presentations that preceded this one, but I'm also going to talk about England. 1998, when the Labour government came into office, saw devolution, and the UK was devolved into 4 nations which are not federal states. You know, they are more autonomous. So I would be here 4 times as long if I talk to you about every system. But the main issues that I will touch on that figure in England are systemic issues that also figure in the other countries, 3 countries that make up the UK. So I hope you'll forgive me for that focus on in England. Well then, there is no automatic right to a place or, you know, in England for children 0 to 5 in early years provision. And there is directly funded provision. I'll unpack that with you for a little bit in a while. But that is determined by age, or as we shall see, that is determined by parental employment status. Now, then there is, apart from the directly funded hours, there are additional childcare hours that parents can pay for, with or without support from the government, largely without, and very high fees you may have read about. So, and that form of childcare is really determined by availability, you know, accessibility, and by price, affordability, and it's a very, very mixed picture. So apart from the figures there about the number of children, the latest figures on the number of children by age in different forms of provision, there is a very uneven distribution of provision. And we see that nearly half of children in nearly half of under 5s live, sorry, I have to look at my slides there, live in childcare deserts. So this is a very bad situation at the moment, because there are many areas of disadvantage in England. Very quickly, I want to look at a bit of history, and my colleague and friend Helen Penn, who many of you know of or know, has written about that very well, the history of childcare and early education provision in England, and she's talked about how public and non-profit provision has really over time evolved in response to perceived need, and how for-profits have developed in response to parental demand, you know. So, and we very much see that non-profits delivering early education originally and moving away from that into much more integrated forms of provision, and then for-profits very much on integrated care and education and in response to the needs of parents where both work. And Helen Penn has just published a new book, which you can access online. And she talks again about the role of community nurseries, for instance, the fact that non-profits, community nurseries, non-profits are very open to children in poverty who try to offer services to children with other needs, a wide range of them. And if I have a motto, it really is about there is no quality without equality. If we do not have integrated provision that is in communities and is open to all children, and we do not have that, and we're moving away from that day by day even further, then that provision cannot be called quality provision. Only where we really are catering for the children in our communities, for all children, can we say that we're beginning to have quality. Now, that whole issue of quality in non-profits versus for-profits has been dealt with by a number of people, amongst them, of course, Cleveland and Krasinski, for instance, groundbreaking and early work on that difference. The blue on your slides, of course, means that if you do get to share the slides, then there will be links to all the relevant literature. And I want to make that point that has already been made several times, notably by Aisling, is that, of course, the pursuit of social impact is not invariably associated with non-profit status, and of that the British public schools are the primary example, really, where having started out long, long ago as services, educational services for the poor, they morphed into elite institutions, completely out of reach of most people, except for the few, students, pupils, mostly they are secondary schools, who get bursaries of some kind, of which those charities, because that's what they are charities, are very proud that, and they're very proud when they lend their vast playing facilities, fields to the local schools, if that happens. But I'm going back to the system as such, because I think some of you may want to know very quickly again, how does that work? I've already mentioned, directly funded provision. Now, where does it happen? Well, we do have a public sector. We have particularly nursery classes in state schools and in academies. What are academies? A multi-academy trust. That is a move under the present government over the last 20 years, really started under Labour, to give schools much more freedom. We know it also from some of the Nordic countries, to be separate and no longer under local government control, to have a direct relationship with central government and basically have freedom also about admissions. And you may agree with me that admission policy is absolutely key to quality and equality. So we have then state nursery schools, separate, that are much more about full-time provision, have a much wider intake than nursery classes. Nursery classes really do not deliver a form of provision that meets the needs of parents in employment. Then we have the private sector, we have the non-profits and the for-profits, large chains. 70% of our places in England are delivered in the private sector, and you can see here the numbers of non-profits versus for-profits. And it's worth to focus for a moment on the fact that the directly funded hours are delivered to children, in 2/3 of children who qualify for those, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and some 2-year-olds, are getting that in the private sector. And it's only 1/3 in the public sector. And finally, remember that the school starting age is 5 and that children generally at 4 go to a reception class. I think in many cases, parents don't even realize that that is not compulsory education, actually. So I'll jump straight to early education and childcare funding, and which is complex. And it sounds as though it's also complex in the territories and provinces of Canada. And we have different forms of subsidies. There is the directly funded provision, which is all changing. We're in the middle of change, but still we've got 15 universal hours, which weekly, that is the format if you receive that as a child in a state nursery class, in a primary school, or if you receive it in a private sector setting, then that might be stretched, over a greater number of weeks, because of course it doesn't really match parental employment patterns. And then we have 30 hours a week for children, 3 and 4-year-olds, whose parents meet certain employment criteria, the children of working parents. So we get provision in state schools that is determined by parental employment status. I find that a very difficult decision to swallow. And then the 15 hours for children, 2-year-olds growing up with disadvantage. Parental subsidies exist as well, but their value has really, really stayed behind compared to the expansion of these publicly funded hours. So I'm going to the right-hand column here, where there is tax-free childcare. It's always been taken up very badly. Parents have never understood how it worked, because it's very complex the way it's described and delivered. We've got childcare support under the benefit system that until this last year was paid retrospectively. That meant parents didn't take it up because it meant all their, down payments on a place in a day nursery and so on had to be done in advance before they got any money back. And of course, as they were on benefits, strongly suggests that they didn't have a lot of money, but the government didn't seem to see that. And then there is spending that has, as I already said, has gone ahead, really outstripped the spending on these funded hours. The direct provision goes straight to providers, has outstripped spending through the other systems. So on my next slide, I very, very quickly go through business models, and I start with non-profits. Christopher has already explained that much better, but we've got charities, of course, registered with the Charity Commission, churches, the why, and social enterprises that can either be registered with the Charity Commission or a separate office. But again, their expectation is that surpluses beyond reasonable income to cover their cost does get reinvested in the business. And then a particular form of provision, charitable incorporated organizations. And I've given you an example, Acorn Early Years Foundation, which are both. And Acorn Early Years Foundation I've singled out because I'm the chair of that, and it is a chain of 16 not-for-profit day nurseries. We also run forest schools and training and catering, and it's in the South Midlands, so it's not in London. Cooperatives, non-profit limited companies, and now for-profits, the business models of for-profits. I would need several forensic accountants to help me explain the business models of for-profits, and I still wouldn't understand them. So I won't go into that, and Aisling has had a very good stab at talking about those models, so we don't need to revisit those. But it's interesting to me that, and that's why I've put it on there, the National Partnership of Early Learning in Childcare has recently been formed, which is a partnership of the 10 largest chains operating in the UK. Again, England has by far the largest population, the largest number of providers. So, because they clearly do not feel represented by the membership organizations that there are for the private sector, which represent the small single operators and so on. And they want to form a pressure group, pressuring the government not to increase regulation and so on, letting them be, liberal approach. So in England as elsewhere, the introduction of serious public funding under the Labour government 1997-2010 meant a step change. It is really which boosted the presence of large for-profit chains and in the childcare market. It was always a childcare market, but then it really became a childcare market. And of course, our colleagues, Susan Prentice and Laura White, have written about that in great detail as it applies in Canada. And the balance between non-profit and for-profit, of course, as in Canada, may vary as it does in different parts of England. But the English childcare market has been skewed towards for-profits even during the Labour administrations, definitely. As soon as big public money came in, that balance changed dramatically. And we now see, as has already been said by Aisling, increased financialization and consolidation, not necessarily an increase in places because it is the smaller providers who are swallowed up, and chains that are very, very heavily indebted, and I was part of the team at University College London led by Antonia Simon, which studied 2 samples, and that work has been built on by the Guardian newspaper, and that's why we now have a much bigger study of the extent to which the childcare market is, of the extent of its fragility really, because of private equity investment in that market. So, how do nations and how does England resist non-profit, the for-profit dominance? Well, obviously, there are different fiscal contexts, there are different socio-cultural contexts, and that impact on the prevalence and the survival of non-profits. How do we support them? There is advocacy, and Boezemeyer and his colleagues at Constance have done very interesting work on that in the European context, about how advocacy movements may support something like, the survival and the strengthening of non-profits. In Germany, for instance, we see that big dominance of the non-profit sector, with strong roles for churches, Protestant in the north, Catholic in the south, who have had the traditional position there. And this whole sector has meant that for-profits do not receive public funding. They're there, 3% of provision is for-profit, but they have to exist on parental income. And there are a lot of rich people in Germany, so they can do. But they can manage. But in the Netherlands, which had to reach the original non-profit dominated childcare market, that has completely reversed in favor of for-profits. And that's so that they haven't had the same dynamics as Germany. They're also a lot smaller, but punch above their weight, I think. You do see in other countries around the world that are experiencing the same demands for provision and a need of expansion. You do see, for instance, in Singapore and in Hong Kong, an active promotion of non-profits, and in Singapore also of public provision, which wasn't there before. So that's interesting. Now, Aisling has already talked about Australia. I just want to say that Australia is an interesting example of non-profits not necessarily being secure. A shift can be in one way and then it can be a shift in the other way again. And that's been described very well by Australian colleagues. So if you're interested in that, you can look it up. So the latest is a report from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission that says that under current regulatory conditions, the childcare market there is not delivering affordability and accessibility. And, for-profits have muscled in on where non-profits were promoted in the wake of the ABC Learning collapse. So the childcare market pressures that England is experiencing are very much as already described by Aisling, because it is to do with the fragility, this incredible indebtedness of our major providers. We're setting ourselves up for a major collapse, as we've had in adult social care, that you might recognize as elder care. The funding that goes into directly provided hours has never been sufficient. In fact, the level of the supply-side subsidy for 3- and 4-year-olds in 2023 was still in value 10% lower than 10 years ago. So there have been enormous losses in terms of the available money. And then, of course, where the for-profits can hike parental fees, grow their debts, and, just focus on better-off families, non-profits are restricted from that. They cannot do that to the same extent, quite rightly. But that means at the moment that you can really see that children who have additional needs, poor children, all the children that should be part of the community provision, should be in there, are losing out because non-profits are also having to shed places that just deliver the so-called funded hours. They have to prioritize parents who will also buy additional childcare hours. Now all that, and then there's a huge retention and recruitment challenge. Now all that is about to change, because earlier I did show you that the current government has decided to double its investment in childcare and to start a program. It started this week, a 3-phase program of rolling out extra provision for children of working parents, absolutely aimed at working parents, starting with 15 hours for 2-year-olds with working parents. That is this week. And then September, it is 15 hours for all children whose parents are in employment, meeting certain employment criteria from 9 months onwards. And then September 25, if this government is still there, which I sincerely hope it isn't, then it will be 30 hours for children from 9 months for whose parents are working. And this, as the sector tells the government, we all tell the government, is completely undeliverable because we haven't got the places. In the settings, we haven't got the spaces for the infants and so on. And we definitely haven't got the staff. And nothing has changed there. So, right, I've got 1 minute? Yeah, okay. So, the size of the challenge. Just a few things there. You can see that non-profits are the primary victims of the dynamics that I've been describing. So 1/3 of non-profits in disadvantaged areas where they predominate were closed or taken over by private companies, including private equity firms, if there was some money to be made. But in some of those areas, there is no money to be made. So the current proposals being rolled up this week will lead to even greater segregation and will lock out even more children suffering disadvantage if this continues, this approach. And that is something that was set by a cross-party committee of the House of Commons, the Education Committee last year. If there's going to be change, childcare workforce must come first, because without the childcare workforce, we're not going anywhere. And the other priority group should be the children, primarily under 5s, who are living in poverty, because our poverty statistics have been going through the roof. And amongst the poor children, Black and children from minority ethnic communities are disproportionately represented. And for instance, in 2022, we had more than 1 million children in the UK experiencing destitution. And you know what that means. No bed, no meals, no heat, no sanitary facilities. And it's hard to imagine that in 2024, in a Western economy, that's what we find. Guardrails around the for-profits, they've all been discussed, so I shan't go through those, but you can look at them later maybe. And of course, rescue and reform. The coalition that I'm working with are 40 organizations, you know, a lot of rescue proposals for now, but how do we tackle reform? And having a debate about the role of non-profits and how we're going to support them, having a debate about income-related fees for parents rather than giving 30 hours free to working parents, and having a national debate about the role of private equity will all have to be part of that reform agenda. Thank you.